Chapter 3. After Deerser and Up and Up had disappeared along the steep trail leading from my front yard to the placer claims, I went outside to take an appraising look at what I was pleased to call my surroundings. In front of the cabin, I found a spot about 20 by 30 feet that had been gouged out of the steep mountainside. Little attempt had been made at leveling it. A wonderful place to break a leg. I seated myself on an oak stump that had been used for a chopping block and let my eyes drink in the sight of the tall firs and pines, the soft, cool gray of the early morning sky. The fringed limbs of the fir trees reached down welcoming arms and seemed to take me in their embrace. I knew I should be a woman of the forest. I felt myself sealed to this new strange way of living by bonds I could not see, but that made me one with God and his forest. There was nothing to be done in the cabin that couldn't be put off. I sat there for an hour while the little granny hatchets got used to the sight of me. I'm deathly afraid of lizards, but kept my seat, watching these small gray ones perched on the rocks, pumping their funny bodies up and down. No doubt considering among themselves if I were a safe landing spot for the jump game they were playing. Then it occurred to me that I'd better look over my property, back of the cabin. There was just room for me to walk between the huge fir that touched one corner of my cabin with its rough bark and the steep slope that went plunging down to the road. On the other side of the shack, there was still less room to walk between it and the bank that rose to a height of 15 to 18 feet. I chose the trail around the fir tree. Once in the backyard, I saw a sagging wooden structure, half in, half out of the bank, which I later found out the boys called the cellar. Apparently, it was intended to serve as a place for storage and a cooler, but not a very safe one, I thought, as there were cracks in the door and a roof wide enough for a squirrel or horrendous thought, a skunk to squeeze through. Further along the bank stood my water barrel, with its constantly replenished supply of cold, clear water. A few feet from the kitchen door was a weather-beaten woodshed large enough to hold a month's supply of stove wood, even in the coldest weather. Next to the riverside of my domain stood a half-dozen small but thrifty peach trees, 2 apricot trees, and a cherry tree that seemed to have lost much of its interest in life. The slender limbs of the peach trees were crowded with round green promises of future juicy goodness, but the apricot and cherry trees were not so prolific. At the far end stood a roofless, 6-foot-high, light framework from which hung shredded remnants of canvas. This puzzled me a moment. Then I saw it was what remained of an outdoor shower. Perhaps the boys would put this potential luxury in working order for me with a branch pipe from the one bringing water to my barrel. I could cover the framework with gunny sacks myself. By this time, the one slice of toast and half a cup of coffee that I had been able to salvage at breakfast began to feel like a pretty slim meal. I went into the kitchen to investigate the grocery box. I had underestimated the appetite of an octogenarian in the woods. It must be the mountain atmosphere, I thought, has pepped up my appetite. I took stock of my groceries and was sure I had been a little hasty in my buying at the store in Arcata. There remained barely enough on which to eke out an existence for 2 or 3 days, provided I had no guests. Well, fortunately, there was a grocery store at Happy Camp, and dear Sir had said he would take me there day after tomorrow. So I opened a small can of tomatoes with a rusty nail and a stick of stove wood and devoured it practically all the contents, along with crackers and potato chips. I ate more than I should because I had my nose in a flower catalog I had picked up in Arcata and nibbled potato chips as a sort of accompaniment to my rosy thoughts. After my stylishly long time out for lunch, I went back into the bedroom to put on the poison green garden hat and flamingo pink smock. Might as well start gardening right. As I moved about, I became conscious again of the strange unevenness underfoot that I had noticed the night before. Stooping to look for the cause, I saw 12-inch wide floorboards that were obviously hand hewn. That meant, I knew, that this part of my cabin had almost certainly been built sometime before 1850, when the first sawmill had been brought into this part of the Siskiyous, or so I'd been told. This gave me a strong feeling of respect for my floor, but I still didn't like the bareness and unevenness of it. Some kind of rug would have to be devised, at least for my bedside, or at least for beside my bed, but I'd think about that later. Just now, I was more interested in getting my flower garden started than in rugs. Out in the front yard, I opened my box of bulbs and seeds. The only digging implement I could find was a mattock, a miner's cast off tool made for giants. I wouldn't let a thing like that stop me, so I began hacking and digging until I got up a wonderful sweat that ran down my back and dripped off my nose. By dint of pitching rocks over the bank and beating clods with the mattock, I made quite a little headway in getting my ground into shape. Among the many items I had bought for my garden was a box of chemical fertilizer, which had a legend on the outside that ran something like this: Excellent results without soil or sand, only water is necessary. Now, I knew enough about gardening to see that I did not have either soil or sand, and partially decomposed granite. But my spring would furnish me lots of water. One must also have faith to grow flowers, and I had oodles of that. I dropped bulbs into the shallow trenches I had scooped out and covered them with granite, earth. Then, by means of a one-woman bucket brigade, I watered them down with my chemical solution. I had a backache by this time that it made it possible for me to straighten up. Sorry. I had a backache by this time that made it impossible for me to straighten up, but I was happy. My flower garden was no longer only a dream, but at least the beginnings of reality. Looking around, I could see that each day, by using elbow grease and honest sweat, I could clear a bit of my little yard of rocks and trash so that flowers might grow and bloom. I had thought I might be lonesome just at first, but how could anyone be lonesome with dozens and dozens of lovely bulbs to sort and find out their names? Indeed, I completely forgot the boys and that they were coming by on their way to Bent Pine Claim after work. I was suddenly stricken with fear of what might happen. Those hungry boys would probably stop and expect to have supper with me. I could, of course, tell them the truth that I had no food to spare, but I hated to have them find out I was so impractical, starting to live in the mountains without enough food to last at least a week. But the really forthright woman is as rare as a wingless angel, and I was no exception. There was no use denying I was up a stump, to use the vernacular. And how was I going to live in the backwoods of a great forest, far from the centers of culture, without using the vernacular, I'd like to know. Then I heard them coming, yelling and shouting like 12-year-old boys. I stepped briskly inside the cabin and closed the door, striving for time to think up a plausible lie that would explain my food shortage and still keep the respect of these new boyfriends. "Hi there, you dumb brute!" Up and Up shouted from somewhere up on the side of the mountain. "I'll break your neck when I catch up with you! Get away from that door!" A terrific lunge against my kitchen door was the answer. I threw it open and faced a mean-looking billy goat who plainly meant me no good. He tossed his shaggy head and greeted me with a vicious "Rah!" Back of him were a dozen or more glassy-eyed creatures who eventually made up his harem. I'd heard that billy goat's butt on the slightest provocation, so I took no chances and slammed the door in his face. Just then, Up and Deerser came down the trail in hot pursuit of their herd. Up in the lead gave a whoop which started the goats down my trail to the road. Deerser paused an instant in his wild flight to shout at me, "We're taking the little nannies home. Bring you some milk in the morning." And the whole entourage, men, nannies, and billy goat, were racing up the road in the direction of Bent Pine Claim. milk, I thought, dismayed. But I don't want any goat's milk. One of my plans had been to lie abed of a morning until the spirit moved to get me up. But next morning I bethought me of these boys coming up with their goat's milk and most likely expecting to be asked for breakfast. So I rose at daylight, but with no plan of coping with the difficulty if it arose. But I was spared. The men arrived early, puffing from their swift climb to my door. Up and Up carried a half-gallon glass jug full of goat's milk and a box of luscious-looking strawberries. Dear Sir had a barley sack half full of something lumpy slung over his shoulder. He dropped it on the floor. We knew you'd be shy of fresh vegetables, so brought you some from our garden. There's about everything in that line you'll need for a few days. With that, he fumbled in the big pocket of his fishing jacket and pulled out what looked like a bundle of ferns. He opened it on the table. I went fishing this morning and got a mess of trout. He spread them out. 16 big rainbows, cleaned, ready to pop into the frying pan. We see you've been planting a garden out front, said Up and Up. It isn't a likely spot for vegetables. Onion sets, for instance, need good loamy soil, he went on seriously. That is, if you expect them to make onions. I wasn't expecting them to make onions, I said, very serious too. I have set out ixias and spiratus and scillas and other things. Oh, well, I don't know much about these newfangled vegetables, but dear madam, I think you need soil for any kind of vegetables. These are flowers, I protested vigorously, and they don't require soil. I have a chemical that makes them grow in water. Oh gosh, dear madam, you need something besides mineral water. You need, I thought he was going to say, common sense. Well, anyway, he went on, you need fertilizer, and I'll fetch you 2 sacks of goat manure tomorrow morning. It's surefire stuff. Now, I thought, how will I ever know if it's goats or chemicals that make my flowers grow? The boys refused my invitation to have coffee, much to my relief, but said they'd drop in for supper and help me eat the trout and strawberries. Keep the milk in the cellar, and the cream will be fine with the berries, said Dear Sir. He must have seen the expression on my face, for he added anxiously, Don't you like goat's milk, dear madam? A white lie came to my lips. I couldn't offend these kind-hearted boys. The truth is, I never use cream on berries. As for goat's milk, I've only tasted it once, and I thought it had, an insipid flavor. They looked at each other. I thought Dear Sir winked at Up and Up. You sound like some women we know here on the river, he said. They vow they can taste goat's milk and spice cake and are sick at their stomachs for a week if they find out they've eaten whipped goat's cream on strawberries. Now tell me honestly, did you smell our billy goat when we took him by here last night? Oh, was that what I smelled? I exclaimed incautiously. I didn't tell them I was almost nauseated by their billy goat. Well, really, I'm not used to billy goats, and I might get used to the smell, I stammered through this lame apology, trying to be truthful as well as tactful and getting nowhere. Well, said Dear Sir, as long as you don't tell us you can smell him as he walks along the road half a mile away, we think he'll pass. Billy smells. You bet he smells. But we won't let him come your way again. We'll be taking him off to pasture in a few days. Until then, we'll keep him staked out on the bar down by the bent place. Bent pine. The little nannies don't smell bad, put in Up and Up, defending his pets. They'll smell as sweet as babies. All babies don't smell sweet, I thought, remembering a woman who believed it was against nature to wash wet ditties. Deities. Ooh, that's gross. We had a square meal that evening. No bread or butter, of course, but everything else anyone could want. Rainbow trout, potatoes, green peas, lettuce, radishes, and green onions in a tossed salad, minus dressing, topped off with strawberries and cream, minus cream for me. After supper, the boys set several traps in a well-meant but, as it proved, a futile effort to rid the cabin of rats and mice. They got a lot of fun out of it. I tried not to jump when the horrid little traps went off with a snap when they weren't set just right. They laughed so uproariously at my involuntary jumping that I suspected them of a considerable trickery. Afterwards, I was glad that I did flinch and jump at every sharp snap. I am sure there would have been 2 disappointed boys if I had been the stolid sort. I exemplified their idea of feminine behavior, and they liked something feminine, even though frayed and worn by age. After they left, I went to bed feeling protected against rats, mice, and housebreakers. I'd stacked up contraption, improving its architecture and making it more devastating if it should be disturbed. This, I said to myself, is part of my secret life. My friends must never suspect me of such weakness and folly.